On the last episode, the Wars of the Roses was the backdrop to endless chaos and rivalry. Edward IV had seized the throne, but his sudden death left a child king and a dangerous power vacuum. The king's trusted brother, Richard of Gloucester, appeared to step in and fill the void, while placing his nephews, the princes, in the Tower of London, swearing to protect them. This is true crime of the historical kind. You're listening to part 2 of the Disappearance of the Princes in the Tower, a royal mystery. If you missed part 1, make sure to go back and listen first. The coronation of Edward V remained delayed. Something was clearly brewing. By law, Edward V should have been crowned by now, with Richard of Gloucester standing in only as Lord Protector. The delay could only mean one thing. Richard was interfering with the succession. Richard was the boy's sole guardian. He held the power. But Edward V's claim was undeniable. Yet he would likely be influenced by his mother's family, the Woodvilles, and that was a risk Richard wasn't willing to take. Even still, in the long run, did Richard truly have more to offer England than the 2 young York princes? At the time, Richard had one legitimate child, a boy named Edward of Middleham. Yes, another Edward. But he was often unwell, and many doubted whether he'd even survive to adulthood, which sadly came true not long after these events. Compared to 2 healthy princes with a direct claim from Edward IV, Richard's long-term position could be seen as fragile. Regardless, he made a drastic and calculated move. Richard declared that his brother Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid from the start. Richard claimed that his brother had been pre-contracted, essentially already promised under church law to another woman before marrying Elizabeth. That would have made the marriage bigamous and their children illegitimate. Though it does seem to be pretty convenient timing. But Richard didn't need the story to be airtight. He just needed the church to back it, and they did. With the princes now declared illegitimate, the line of succession shifted, conveniently, to Richard. In July 1483, just a few months after Edward IV's death, Richard of Gloucester held his own coronation. He was then crowned King Richard III. The princes, once the future of the Yorkist line, were notably absent from the ceremony. Presumably, they remained behind the walls of the tower. This sparked massive amounts of speculation and fear as to why they were not at the coronation. Where were the princes? We can only guess how the young York princes might have spent their time in captivity. Historical accounts place them in the Garden Tower, which was later called the Bloody Tower, in rooms that were suited for royalty. But even still, it was a cage. And people were noticing that the princes were being seen less and less. The final account of the princes being seen alive shows their innocence. In midsummer, they were last seen playing in the garden of the tower. Then, they simply disappeared. Richard III gave no explanation for where they were or why they were no longer in public view. He simply carried on and ruled alone. Of course, that didn't stop people from wondering what happened to the princes. Whispers became rumors, and rumors spiraled into accusations. Were they sick? Had they died of illness? That would have made sense. Nearly half of all children in the 15th century didn't even make it to their 15th birthday. Or had some Lancastrian assassin managed to enter the tower and kill them in their sleep, knowing that their claim was the greatest threat? Others were more hopeful. What if the boys managed to escape and were now being hidden for their protection until they got older? But then, the darkest, probably most logical question: what if Richard had them killed? And if he did, why the silence? Why not blame a rival or claim they had died of sickness or even accuse them of treason, put them on trial? We've seen plenty of Plantagenets use the legal system to execute a rival. But These were children. Except to Richard, these weren't just boys, they were two future men, both with a stronger claim to the throne than his. If they survived or were found, it could all unravel. Richard had seen what happened to kings who hesitated. He knew he couldn't just sideline a threat forever. But even if it was obvious that Richard had the most to gain from removing the princes from power, there was no proof that he had them harmed in any way. Later accounts would suggest otherwise, though the motive would be complicated. In real time, there were other threats to worry about. As a matter of fact, there was a huge one just across the channel. There was a person with a distant but very real claim to the English throne. He was watching and waiting for the right time to strike. His name was Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor was the son of Edmund Tudor, a Lancastrian lord who had been captured by the Yorks just months before Henry was born. He died in Yorkish captivity of the plague, but some suspected the Yorks had murdered him, just furthering the bad blood between Lancasters and Yorks. Henry's claim to the throne actually came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, though the claim itself was pretty shaky to say the least. Margaret was just a young girl. She was only 13 years old when Henry was born. And during the tumultuous back and forth between Yorks and Lancasters, Henry was sent away to safety in France. There, Henry lived in exile for nearly 14 years, just waiting for his chance at the crown. The perfect opportunity presented itself after the death of Edward IV, the mysterious disappearances of the princes, and the rise of the controversial Richard III. Henry now had a solid rallying cry. He called Richard a tyrant, a usurper, and a monster who had murdered his own nephews to steal the throne. Whether the accusations were true didn't really matter. Support for Henry was growing. Not just among old Lancastrians, but among disillusioned Yorkists and members of the Woodville family. By 1485, just 2 years after Richard seized the crown, Henry made his move. He returned to English soil, rising out of exile with an army behind him, funded by his backers and timed perfectly to strike. Henry Tudor challenged Richard III for the throne of England. The two forces met at the Battle of Bosworth Field, a brutal, muddy clash to determine the king. Richard was once a feared and capable warrior. As expected, he fought fiercely. Yet, Richard's own allies turned against him in the 11th hour. Desperate and cornered, Richard led a cavalry charge aimed to strike down Henry Tudor himself. But the attempt failed. Richard was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and killed. Richard III became the last English king to ever die in battle, and the final Plantagenet king. Richard's naked corpse was slung over a horse and paraded through Leicester, publicly humiliating him in death. Just like that, the crown changed hands. With Richard dead, in steps the victor. Henry Tudor claimed the throne by right of conquest and was crowned King Henry VII of England. With this turn of events, you might be wondering, could the princes still be alive, and if so, would they now step forward? Edward V would be a lot older and could reclaim his throne, bringing the Yorkist line back into power. Yet, no one appeared, and no explanation came, at least for now. So how would Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian in exile who had spent most of his life in France, take the English crown that had once belonged to a York? Well, if you remember, the missing princes had a sister, Princess Elizabeth of York. And not long after his victory, Henry married her. It was a brilliant strategic move, not just politically, but symbolically. By marrying the daughter of Edward IV, Henry united the warring houses of Lancaster and York and forged an entirely new dynasty, the Tudors. The red rose of the Lancasters and the white rose of the Yorks merged into one and created the iconic Tudor rose. It's a beautiful red and white emblem of unity. It was used on banners, coins, palaces as a promise to move forward in peace. You can still find it used throughout England to this day. That said, Elizabeth of York became queen, but the cost was steep. She had lost nearly all of her male relatives. Her father, uncles, cousins, and her brothers were still missing. This is a mini look ahead, but she would eventually give birth to one of the most infamous monarchs in English history, Henry VIII. Yes, that Henry with all the wives. But wait, how did this new monumental union work so well if the church had deemed the York children as illegitimate? For Henry VII to legitimize his own rule, he had to re-legitimize the union between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, and by extension, re-legitimize their children, meaning Elizabeth of York and the missing princes. The problem with that was that the fate of the princes remained a mystery, and by re-legitimizing them, Henry opened the door for pretenders to step forward. It also meant that Henry Tudor had just as much motive for the princes, his brothers-in-law, to be dead and stay dead as Richard III had. Because without bodies, without graves, and without answers, the questions continued. What if the princes had survived? What if they were simply waiting for the right moment, biding their time until it was safe to return? After all, isn't that exactly what Henry Tudor did early in life, lived in exile until it was safe to come forward? So, as new claimants began to emerge, people were left wondering, were these people imposters, opportunists, or could they be something more? In 1487, just 2 years into Henry's reign, the first major threat would put those questions to the test. Yorkist loyalists began to rally behind Edward Plantagenet. If you'll recall, Edward Plantagenet is the son of George, the Duke of Clarence, meaning he was the nephew of King Edward IV and a cousin to the missing princes. This was a royal who had once been in the line of succession. This claim started a rebellion against Henry Tudor. He was even crowned Edward VI in Ireland. But lucky for Henry, he had a trump card. When Henry came to power, he took the real Edward Plantagenet and held him in, you guessed it, the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned ever since. So when the rebellion gained traction, Henry paraded the real Edward Plantagenet through the streets of London, publicly exposing the impostor and discrediting the claim. Eventually, the rebel army was crushed at the Battle of Stoke Field, the final engagement of the Wars of the Roses. The so-called Edward Plantagenet was captured, and he turned out to be no royal at all. His real name was said to be Lambert Simnel, just a 10-year-old boy from a humble background who was being used as a figurehead by Yorkist plotters. Instead of execution, Henry showed mercy, likely because of the boy's young age. Simnel was even given a job in the royal kitchens and eventually became a falconer, which is a strange twist of fate for a would-be king. The more serious challenge came a few years later with the appearance of a claimant saying he was Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the missing princes. According to his story, his older brother Edward V had been killed, but he was spared because of his age, which naturally would mean that the so-called Richard of Shrewsbury was now the current true heir. This claim gained serious traction. He won support not only in England, but across Europe, even from King James IV of Scotland and Margaret of Burgundy, who is the prince's aunt. She vouched for his authenticity. We have to keep in mind that in a Europe still deeply entangled with England's royal bloodlines, the mystery of the missing princes wasn't just an English problem. It had become a diplomatic weapon. Finally, in 1497, after a fortune was spent in defense, the rebellion was crushed, much to Henry VII's relief. The pretender was captured, and his name was found to be Perkin Warbeck. Warbeck was imprisoned in, of course, the Tower of London. Ironically, the very place that he had once claimed to have escaped from. At first, Henry VII spared him, but after an attempted escape from the tower, Warbeck was executed by hanging in Tyburn, a place that's known for its gallows. While he was at it, Henry VII also executed the real Edward Plantagenet for supposedly being a part of the plot for Warbeck's escape, but there are many other more likely scenarios. He was at least given a royal beheading, which frankly was far more merciful than hanging in Tyburn. Other than the unaccounted for princes, the final male Plantagenet with any serious claim to the throne was now dead, and not by any fault of his own. For more on Edward Plantagenet, I'll have a bonus sideshow episode focusing on him, his life, and his execution, so watch out for that. Anyway, while we know the Tudors had won, their victory was far from innocent. So it's worth asking, what if the Tudors had found the princes alive in the tower when they took the throne? From what we've seen, it's unlikely they would have survived. From there, the Tudors were just getting started on their own infamous reign. They would soon have plenty of their own problems, but for now, their hold on the throne was secure. To maintain that security, Henry needed two things widely accepted: that the princes were dead and that Richard III had murdered them. After all, Henry VII's claim to the throne wasn't all that solid, and many still saw the Yorks as the rightful ruling family. The best way to strengthen his position was to destroy Richard's, while reiterating that there was no chance the princes could be alive. The Tudors were wildly successful at propagandizing Richard III as an evil monster. This image took hold in ballads, biographies, and eventually in literature. None other than William Shakespeare would immortalize Richard III as one of literature's greatest villains. He wrote his infamous play Richard III around 1593, more than 100 years after the real events, which is where many first hear of the story of the princes in the tower. But long after the plays ended, the tower itself had more to the story to share. Nearly 200 years after the prince's disappearance, a discovery reignited the debate all over again. In 1674, renovations were being made in the Tower of London. Workers happened upon a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the skeletal remains of two small bodies. Given the location, the size of the bones, and the tower's grim history, it seemed confirmed that the remains of the missing princes had finally been found. The remains were officially declared to be those of Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury, and were reburied with royal honors in Westminster Abbey. They erected a plaque in commemoration, which translated from Latin reads, "Here lie the relics of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, sons of Edward IV, one of whom, after the death of their father, before he had reached his 12th year, together with his brother, was by their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, confined in the Tower of London, and there secretly slain. Their bones, long sought after and wished for, were found buried deep beneath the stairs that led to the chapel of the White Tower on the 17th of July in the year of our Lord 1674, and by the command of Charles II, were here honorably laid to rest in the year 1678. Needless to say, the public was fascinated by the discovery. Yet, by today's standards, the remains alone would not be considered definitive proof. Then, fast forward to 1789, another surprise involving this family surfaced during renovations, this time at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, which is the burial place for Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. Inside their tomb, workers discovered two small lead coffins. At first, it was assumed that these were the remains of two of their children, George and Mary, who had died young. But then, in 1810, the actual lead coffins of George and Mary were discovered elsewhere in the chapel. These were clearly labeled. Which begs the question, who exactly then are the children buried in the tomb with Edward and Elizabeth? People couldn't help but speculate, what if these were the princes? It's possible they were hidden in secret and reunited in death with their parents. It's never been proven, but like so much in this case, it simply adds another complicated layer to the mystery. This theory is usually overshadowed by the more familiar story that the prince's remains were the ones discovered at the tower. Those remains were last examined in 1933, long before modern DNA technology was available. At the time, the examiner stated that the ages were 12 and 9, which at first glance seems to line up perfectly with the ages of Edward V and his brother. But is it a little too perfect? Without DNA, assigning such precise ages does feel a bit like confirmation bias. Since then, many have called for further testing, but Queen Elizabeth II never granted permission. Maybe it was out of respect for royal burial sites or out of caution. In the end, she stated that she wanted the remains, whoever they may be, to rest in peace. Today, with the rise of forensic science and genetic testing, interest in finally solving the mystery has only grown, even after all these centuries. Now, under King Charles III, which will probably always feel weird to say, there's speculation that he's a little more open to giving permission for further testing. Yet, even if permission is granted, there's no guarantee that the remains contain enough viable DNA to give a clear answer anyway. For now, the remains beneath Westminster Abbey rest in peace. Meanwhile, the mystery refuses to die. Modern researchers like Philippa Langley have reopened the case, scouring European archives and chasing the possibility that history may have got it wrong. She suggests that it's at least possible that the princes did indeed escape. I read her book, The Princes in the Tower, where she discusses the evidence that perhaps Richard was innocent and the princes could have lived their lives under new names. It is an interesting read. I'll have my Goodreads account linked in the notes if you want to dive into it. But it should be said, this theory is currently seen as fringe belief. Though modern historians are generally much more open to re-evaluating the image of Richard III and his potential role in the infamous disappearance. And it just goes to show, there are still so many unanswered questions. But what's tangible to us today in this story is the Tower of London. Still mighty, but now surrounded by a modern, bustling city. You can find yourself behind the tower walls, listen to tour guides as they share stories of ghost sightings, and even see the exhibit under the staircase for yourself. All we can do is imagine what may have happened there. Whether they were murdered by their uncle, smuggled away, or erased by a different enemy entirely, we don't know. Outside the tower, the River Thames has continued to flow quietly as the world moved on without ever knowing what happened to the princes in the tower. This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Make sure to like or subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you for listening. Bye.